Iran's top diplomat says talks between the U.S. and Iran in Oman are off to a very good start. Oman's foreign minister posted these photos on X saying, quote, "The talks highlighted their importance in light of the parties' commitment to ensuring their success and sustaining security and stability. The meeting was an attempt to de-escalate tensions after the U.S. bombed Iranian nuclear sites and Tehran launched a crackdown on nationwide protests there." Now, the Omani foreign minister says he hopes this round of negotiations will pave the way for a lasting understanding between Iran and the U.S. Let's bring in foreign correspondent Tom Soufi-Burridge and ABC News national security and defense analyst Mick Mulroy for more. Hi to you both. So, Tom, the U.S. delegation and Iranians were negotiating indirectly here. So what do we know about how these talks played out?
Yeah, so effectively the two delegations, Diane, were in the same location, but they weren't in the same room. And effectively the Omanis were talking to each side separately. So you had the US delegation, including Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner. We've also confirmed, according to a US source, that the commander of US CENTCOM, so the top military commander in the region, was also there. Bradley Cooper. So it is an interesting dynamic. You had the two sides effectively negotiating not with each other but with the Omanis. But as you say, the foreign secretary, the foreign minister of Oman, just coming out with comments just now calling the talks positive, and Axios is reporting, quoting one source, saying that there will be talks in the coming days. So that is critical. Effectively, it looks like they have been negotiating on the possible framework for possible direct negotiations between the US and Iran, and that would be another step forward.
Mick, Oman officials praised goodwill, responsibility, the seriousness of Iran for meeting for these talks. But what needs to happen from a U.S. perspective in order for these negotiations to be successful?
So, Diane, I think ultimately the United States wants to include not just the nuclear restrictions against Iran getting a nuclear weapon, but also some kind of curtailing of their ballistic missile program and their support to proxy organizations or terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. I don't know that the U.S. will actually get all those things. It's unlikely that Iran will concede much on ballistic missiles, as they think that's paramount to their own security, or support to proxies, which is how they execute their national security strategy. But this is something very important for the Trump administration, and one of the reasons why during the first Trump administration they pulled out of the JCPOA. So we'll have to see just how willing Iran is to concede on these items. But this, I mean, it's good. It's off to a good start. I would agree with that. And diplomacy is the way this should head. But ultimately, it's going to come down to what Iran's willing to do. And the U.S. obviously is postured to take military action if these fall apart.
And Tom, the U.S. and Iranian positions seem pretty far apart here. So what are you watching for as this develops?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is definitely true. I mean, going into these talks, as Mick was just outlining there, the US administration is asking for certain things like controls on Iran's ballistic missile program, like its relationship with its proxies in the region, which up until now the Iranians have signaled going into the talks, which they're not willing to compromise on. I mean, especially on their missile defense program, their ballistic missiles or offensive missile program. So, these type of issues, in principle will be very difficult, and there we have to be compromises to get to a deal. And really, the nuclear program, Iran's nuclear program, is at the crux of everything. And look, the White House continues to say that basically, there should be zero nuclear in Iran, zero nuclear program. But what exactly that means in practice is also going to be part of these talks. I mean, look, Iran has said they're willing to have a negotiation, which would mean that they wouldn't have the ability to enrich uranium to weapons-grade material and therefore have a nuclear weapon. That doesn't mean that Iran is willing to completely rule out its nuclear program altogether. And it would want trade-offs, right? It would want sanctions to be lifted in response to that, because Iran's economy at the moment is in dire straits. And obviously that has, put the regime itself in a very, very difficult position. We've seen the protests and the violent crackdown from the regime just weeks ago. So, all of this is playing into it. It's a very, very complex situation. Of course, at the same time, the US has major military assets in the region, dangling that threat of potential military strikes into Iran. But even that would be hugely complex, hugely risky, potentially widening the dispute between Iran and the US into a wider conflict, and it would put potentially US bases in the regions at risk. So, all of this has to play out, and therefore, at the moment, I mean, there are positive signs coming out, I think, from today, but it is small steps forward in a very, very complex picture.
Meanwhile, Russia says the Russia-U.S. nuclear arms control agreement has expired. Now President Trump is calling for U.S. nuclear experts to work on a new, improved, and modernized treaty that he says can last long into the future instead of extending it. What do you make of that?
Well, that certainly was one way to do it. Another way to do it was extend the current agreement so they kept the limitations on testing, on the limitations on deployed nuclear weapons, and the means to deliver it. But I think the United States really wants to have this expanded and, as you just said, modernized to include countries like China, which are a growing nuclear power and could be a growing nuclear power now, especially since there's really no restrictions internationally. So hopefully they move quickly toward a new agreement that could include many other countries and could be updated to include the new delivery system. So that would be positive. Not sure why we didn't extend it, but we're already there. So let's see how it goes forward.
Tom Sufi Burridge, Mick Mulroy, thank you.